Warren says he sat with you at the Blackstone walkthrough last Tuesday. I was with you all day Tuesday, Adrienne. You never left this office. I don't know what you're talking about. Neither do I. That's the problem.
Warren says he sat with you at the Blackstone walkthrough last Tuesday. Tamsin stood in the doorway of Adrienne's studio, arms folded, her expression somewhere between confused and unsettled. I was with you all day Tuesday, Adrienne. You never left this office. Adrienne set down the fabric swatch in her hand. I don't know what you're talking about. Neither do I, Tamsin said. That's the problem. Adrienne Foss had spent 8 years building Foss Interiors into a name serious clients sought out specifically, a reputation earned one demanding project at a time. What she was about to learn, standing in her own studio while her business partner searched her face for an explanation neither of them yet had, was that a version of her had apparently been meeting with clients, closing deals, and quietly redirecting money for the better part of 2 years, without Adrienne ever once being in the room. How does a twin sister impersonate you convincingly enough to fool your own clients for 2 years running? What does she actually gain by disappearing so completely into someone else's identity instead of building anything of her own? And what happens the moment a single confused client's offhand comment finally exposes the entire thing? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how something like this stays hidden for 2 full years, you have to go back to a childhood spent as identical twins, and to the very specific weight that comes with sharing a face with someone whose life keeps quietly outpacing your own. Adrienne and Deja Foss were born 11 minutes apart, identical enough that even close family occasionally needed a moment to be certain which twin they were speaking to, a confusion that followed both of them cheerfully through childhood and became considerably more complicated once their adult lives began to diverge. Adrienne found her direction early, drawn to design and space and color in a way that felt, even as a teenager, like the clearest expression of who she actually was. Deja, equally sharp and equally capable by every measure that mattered, spent her 20s searching for the same kind of clarity without ever quite landing on it. Their childhood together held real closeness alongside the growing comparison, the two of them sharing a bedroom until high school, developing the specific shorthand twins often build, finishing each other's sentences, sensing each other's moods without needing to ask. Adrienne remembered specifically a stretch during middle school when the two of them deliberately swapped identities for an entire week as a game, fooling teachers and even a few family friends, an early experiment in the exact confusion that would, decades later, curdle into something considerably more serious. Their parents, without ever saying so explicitly, treated the two sisters slightly differently almost from the moment Adrienne's interests crystallized into something concrete, praising her focus in a way that, in hindsight, subtly framed Deja's ongoing search as a kind of drifting rather than simply a different timeline. Deja absorbed this comparison for years without fully naming it, a quiet resentment building beneath a relationship that, from the outside, looked like the closest possible bond two sisters could share. Deja's 20s were defined by a series of ventures that each carried real promise before ultimately faltering. A boutique clothing shop she opened at 24 that closed within 18 months after a landlord dispute she never fully recovered from financially. A personal styling business she launched at 27 that generated enthusiastic early interest before quietly fading once she struggled to convert initial consultations into steady, paying clients. Adrienne supported her through each collapse the way any close sister would, offering encouragement, occasional financial help, and the specific kind of patience that comes from genuinely wanting someone to find their footing. The boutique's closure hit Deja especially hard, coming after nearly 2 years of genuine effort, long hours, and a level of financial risk that left her considerably worse off than before she'd started. Adrienne remembered helping her sister pack up the empty storefront on the shop's final day, both of them crying in a space that had represented, for Deja, a real chance at finally building something entirely her own. Adrienne offered, in the aftermath, to help fund whatever Deja tried next, an offer born from genuine love that she never once imagined would eventually factor into anything resembling what came later. What Adrienne didn't fully register, busy building her own company through those same years, was how each failure compounded something in Deja that eventually calcified into more than ordinary discouragement. Deja began, somewhere in her early 30s, to experience her sister's steady, visible success less as something to celebrate and more as a constant, painful measuring stick, one made considerably sharper by how easily people occasionally still confused the two of them physically while their actual lives grew more and more unequal. Foss Interiors, meanwhile, expanded steadily under Adrienne's direction, growing from a single client operation run out of her apartment into a 9-person studio with a client roster that included some of the city's more prominent homeowners and small commercial spaces. Adrienne brought on Tamsin Reed as a business partner during the company's 4th year, a sharp, detail-oriented operator whose strengths complemented Adrienne's creative instincts almost perfectly. The two of them building a partnership Adrienne came to rely on for nearly every operational decision the growing business required. Tamsin had come from a background in commercial property management before joining Foss Interiors, bringing a level of financial discipline to the studio that Adrienne, gifted creatively but less naturally inclined toward the operational side of running a business, found genuinely invaluable. The two women developed a close working friendship over the following years, Tamsin becoming, in many ways, the person Adrienne trusted most completely within the professional side of her life, a trust that would eventually prove essential once everything with Deja finally came to light. The specific opportunity that eventually allowed Deja's impersonation to take root began innocently enough, during the studio's 6th year, when Adrienne's schedule grew genuinely unmanageable across an expanding client list, forcing her to occasionally ask Deja, then between ventures again, for small favors related to the business, picking up fabric samples from a vendor across town, sitting in briefly at a site walkthrough when Adrienne was double-booked with 2 clients on the same afternoon. These early favors felt, to Adrienne, like a natural extension of the closeness the two sisters had always shared, a way of including Deja in her professional life during a stretch when Deja's own career prospects felt particularly uncertain. Adrienne remembered feeling genuinely grateful during this period, believing the small tasks gave Deja a sense of purpose and connection to something successful during a difficult chapter, never once suspecting the arrangement was quietly evolving into something considerably more troubling. Adrienne trusted Deja completely with these small tasks, never once suspecting that her sister was using the moments of overlap not simply to help, but to begin quietly inserting herself directly into specific client relationships, taking advantage of their identical appearance and the natural confusion it created to occasionally answer as Adrienne herself during brief interactions clients assumed, without any reason to question it, were simply Adrienne handling business as usual. The impersonation started small, Deja later admitted, a single moment during an early walkthrough where a client mistook her for Adrienne and Deja, rather than correcting the confusion immediately, allowed it to continue for the length of that one meeting, discovering in the process an unexpected, intoxicating sense of what it felt like to be treated, even briefly, with the same respect and deference her sister's business had spent years earning. That single unclaimed moment became, over the following months, a pattern Deja returned to deliberately rather than accidentally, volunteering more frequently for tasks that put her in direct contact with clients, occasionally using a second phone she'd acquired specifically for this purpose to respond to client texts and emails as though she were Adrienne, drawing on her genuine, intimate familiarity with her sister's speech patterns, professional vocabulary, and design philosophy to make the impersonation seamless enough that no client ever thought to question it. Adrienne remained entirely unaware of the growing scope of what her sister was doing, occupied fully with the demands of running an expanding business, and trusting the small favors Deja continued offering as nothing more than genuine sisterly support during a busy stretch. Tamsin, similarly, had no reason to suspect anything unusual, occasionally noting Deja's presence at the studio without ever imagining the actual extent of what those visits had quietly grown to include. The financial dimension of the impersonation developed roughly a year into the pattern, once Deja had built enough independent rapport with a handful of clients to feel confident redirecting certain payments without immediate detection. She established a separate account under a name close enough to Foss Interior's actual business name that a client glancing quickly at payment instructions might reasonably assume it was simply a variation of the studio's standard invoicing, funneling a modest but steadily growing portion of specific project payments away from the company's real accounts and into her own. Warren Blackstone became, over the following year, one of the clients Deja managed most extensively under this arrangement, a wealthy commercial property owner whose ongoing renovation projects gave her regular, recurring opportunities to maintain the impersonation across dozens of individual interactions spread across nearly 18 months. Warren, genuinely pleased with what he believed was Adrienne's consistent attention to his growing portfolio of properties, had no reason whatsoever to suspect he'd actually been working with two different women who happened to share an identical face. Deja studied Adrienne's professional mannerisms with a precision that unsettled Adrienne considerably once she finally understood the full extent of it, learning the specific vocabulary Adrienne used when discussing design concepts, the particular rhythm of her emails, small verbal habits that made the impersonation nearly undetectable to anyone who didn't know Adrienne with genuine intimacy. Warren, over the course of their many interactions, came to describe Adrienne as one of the most consistently attentive professionals he'd ever worked with, a compliment that, once Adrienne eventually learned its full context, felt considerably more complicated than flattering. Deja managed the impersonation carefully enough during this stretch to avoid any single moment dramatic enough to raise suspicion, spacing out her direct client interactions, relying on genuine familiarity with ongoing projects to speak convincingly about details she'd absorbed secondhand through her access to studio materials and her sister's own conversations. She grew, over those 18 months, increasingly comfortable inhabiting this version of herself, describing it much later as the first time in years she'd felt genuinely competent and respected in a professional setting, an admission that complicated, without excusing, the scope of what she'd actually done. The unraveling began almost by accident, during an ordinary conversation between Tamsin and Warren at an unrelated industry event neither Adrienne nor Deja attended, when Warren mentioned, in passing, a specific design decision he credited to a walkthrough the previous Tuesday, referencing details about the conversation that immediately struck Tamsin as inconsistent with what she knew of Adrienne's actual schedule that particular day. Tamsin didn't raise the discrepancy with Warren directly in the moment, unwilling to embarrass either herself or her business partner in front of an important client before understanding what was actually going on, choosing instead to simply note the inconsistency and return to it privately once she had a chance to speak with Adrienne alone. She spent the remainder of that industry event distracted, running through the conversation repeatedly in her mind, increasingly certain something didn't add up. Tamsin returned to the studio the following morning and asked Adrienne directly about the Tuesday walkthrough Warren had described. Watching Adrienne's confusion deepen the more specific Tamsin's questions became, both women slowly realizing, in real time, that neither of them could account for a meeting Warren was absolutely certain had happened exactly as he remembered it. Adrienne's first instinct was to assume some kind of scheduling mix-up or a client simply misremembering a date, though the specificity of the details Warren had shared, references to particular fabric choices and design language that sounded genuinely like Adrienne's own professional voice, made a simple mistake feel increasingly unlikely the longer she and Tamsin discussed it. It was Tamsin, working through the timeline carefully, who first suggested, almost reluctantly, that the answer might involve Deja. Adrienne resisted the suggestion initially, unable to imagine her sister doing something this elaborate, though the moment the possibility was named out loud, several previously unremarkable memories began rearranging themselves with new, uncomfortable weight. Small comments Deja had made over the preceding months referencing details about clients Adrienne didn't remember sharing with her. An unusual familiarity Deja occasionally displayed toward ongoing projects she'd supposedly only helped with briefly. Adrienne and Tamsin spent the following several days quietly digging through the studio's client communications and financial records, cross-referencing dates, comparing writing patterns across emails supposedly sent by Adrienne, and gradually assembling a timeline that confirmed, with mounting horror, that this wasn't an isolated incident, but a sustained pattern stretching back nearly 2 years, touching at least 3 major clients who had each, at various points, unknowingly interacted with Deja believing they were speaking with Adrienne the entire time. The process of building that timeline proved emotionally exhausting for Adrienne in ways she hadn't anticipated, each newly confirmed instance of impersonation landing like a small, separate betrayal rather than a single unified discovery, forcing her to relive the same shock repeatedly as she and Tamsin worked methodically through months of archived correspondence. She found herself, more than once during those days, staring at an email she'd assumed she'd written herself, unable to fully recall whether she genuinely had. The impersonation so thorough it briefly destabilized her confidence in her own memory of the past 2 years. The financial records proved the most damning piece of the discovery, Tamsin identifying the separate account with the deceptively similar business name within a single afternoon of careful review, tracing payments from Warren Blackstone and two other clients that had been quietly diverted there over the preceding year, a sum that, once fully tallied, represented a genuinely significant portion of revenue the studio had never actually received. Tamsin walked Adrienne through the financial documentation slowly, watching her partner's expression shift from disbelief to a kind of numb, exhausted anger as the actual dollar figures became clear, considerably larger than either of them had initially guessed based on the surface-level pattern they'd first noticed. Adrienne asked to see the account name again, staring at the subtle, deliberate similarity to the studio's actual business name, understanding the level of premeditation required to establish something that's specifically designed to avoid immediate suspicion. Adrienne sat with the full scope of the discovery for nearly 2 full days before deciding how to approach Deja directly, moving through those 48 hours in a strange, disorienting state she later described as grieving someone who was still, technically, right there and reachable by phone, understanding that whatever conversation came next would permanently reshape a relationship that had defined her entire life up to that point. She spent much of that waiting period replaying years of memories with new, uncomfortable scrutiny, wondering how many other small moments she'd never questioned might actually connect to what she now understood as a much larger pattern. She barely slept during those 2 days, caught between wanting to confront Deja immediately and needing time to fully absorb the scope of what she'd learned before facing her sister directly. She confronted Deja at Deja's own apartment rather than the studio, wanting privacy for a conversation she suspected would be difficult regardless of how it unfolded, bringing with her the specific documentation she and Tamsin had assembled rather than relying on accusation alone. Deja opened the door already visibly braced for something. Whatever composure she'd maintained through 2 years of careful impersonation clearly straining under the weight of Adrienne's expression alone. "How long?" Adrienne asked, once they were both seated, sliding the printed timeline across the coffee table between them. "I want the real number, Deja, not an estimate." Deja looked at the documents for a long moment before answering, something in her posture shifting from defensive to genuinely resigned. "Almost 2 years," she said quietly. "It started small. One walkthrough. I didn't plan any of it. But you kept doing it," Adrienne said. "For 2 years. You kept being me." Deja didn't offer the kind of clean apology Adrienne had braced herself for. She talked instead, haltingly at first, and then with more open frustration, about a lifetime of watching Adrienne's path crystallize early while her own kept collapsing beneath her despite genuine effort, about the specific, corrosive experience of sharing a face with someone whose success made her own repeated failures feel considerably more visible than they might have otherwise. "We're identical, Adrienne," Deja said. "We grew up sharing everything, clothes, friends. Half the time people couldn't even tell us apart. I never saw it as stealing. I saw it as finally getting a piece of the life everyone always assumed I should have had too, since apparently we're supposed to be interchangeable anyway, whenever it's convenient." "You didn't share my life," Adrienne said. "You took specific pieces of it without asking, and you took money that belonged to my business while you did it. That's not the same thing as being twins, Deja. That's identity theft with extra steps, and I trusted you enough that it never once occurred to me to suspect it." Deja tried, several times over the course of the conversation, to reframe specific moments as harmless, arguing that most of the client interactions she'd handled had gone well, that she'd genuinely represented the studio competently during those meetings, a defense Adrienne found almost more unsettling than if Deja had simply been careless or incompetent during the impersonation. Understanding that her sister's genuine skill at pretending to be her only made the entire betrayal feel more deliberate rather than less. "You keep talking about how well you did it," Adrienne said. "Like that's supposed to make me feel better." "It doesn't, Deja. It just means you were careful. It means you knew exactly what you were doing every single time, for 2 years, and you decided the risk was worth it because you'd gotten good enough at being me that you thought I'd never find out." Deja didn't have a response that softened that particular observation. She sat quietly for a moment before continuing, admitting that somewhere during the second year, the impersonation had stopped feeling like an occasional lapse and had started feeling, disturbingly, like simply an alternate version of her life she could step into whenever her own felt too difficult to face directly. Adrienne asked directly about the diverted payments, watching Deja's justification grow noticeably thinner on that specific point, unable to frame redirected client money with the same emotional language she'd used to explain the identity impersonation itself. Deja eventually admitted the money had started as what she told herself was fair compensation for the actual work she was doing during those client interactions, a rationalization that had grown easier to maintain the longer the arrangement continued undetected. "Fair compensation," Adrienne repeated. "You set up an account with a name close enough to mine that a client wouldn't look twice at it. That's not compensation, Deja. That's a plan. You built a system specifically designed so I'd never catch it, and you're sitting here telling me it just sort of happened." Deja's composure finally broke fully at that point, the frustration in her voice giving way to something closer to genuine grief, admitting that she'd known, somewhere underneath the justifications, exactly how deliberate the entire arrangement actually was, and that she'd simply gotten too far into it to imagine any version of stopping that didn't involve losing everything, including, she said quietly, the relationship with Adrienne she now understood she was actively destroying with every month the impersonation continued. The conversation ended without resolution, Adrienne leaving Deja's apartment with the documentation still in hand, understanding clearly that whatever came next would require considerably more than a single difficult conversation to fully address. She spent that night at Tamsin's apartment rather than her own, unable to face the quiet of her home immediately after a conversation that had reshaped her understanding of the person she'd once trusted more completely than almost anyone else in her life. Adrienne and Tamsin spent the following weeks methodically rebuilding the parts of the business Deja's impersonation had touched, reaching out personally to each of the 3 affected clients, including Warren Blackstone, to explain what had actually happened and to make clear, without excusing any part of it, exactly how the studio intended to make things right. Warren, initially stunned by the revelation, ultimately appreciated Adrienne's direct, transparent handling of the situation enough to remain a client, an outcome Adrienne hadn't fully expected but was deeply grateful for given everything else the discovery had cost her. Warren's reaction, once Adrienne finally sat down with him to explain everything directly, surprised her considerably. He asked pointed, understandable questions about how something like this had been possible, listening carefully as Adrienne walked him through the specific vulnerabilities in the studio's previous systems, ultimately telling her that her willingness to explain the full situation honestly, rather than minimizing it, mattered more to him than the fact that it had happened at all. He remained one of the studio's most loyal clients in the year that followed, occasionally checking in on how Adrienne was managing the aftermath in a way she found genuinely touching. The other 2 affected clients required more delicate handling, one choosing to end the relationship with Foss Interiors entirely despite Adrienne's efforts to rebuild trust, the other remaining, but with visibly diminished warmth that took months of consistent, careful communication to even partially restore. Adrienne absorbed both outcomes without much visible bitterness, understanding that whatever trust Deja's impersonation had damaged, rebuilding it was now squarely Adrienne's responsibility regardless of who had actually caused the breach. The client who left provided Adrienne with a particularly difficult final conversation, expressing genuine sympathy for Adrienne's situation while explaining, honestly, that the discovery had fundamentally shaken their confidence in a business relationship built on personal trust in a way they didn't feel equipped to rebuild. Adrienne respected the decision without arguing against it, understanding that not every relationship damaged by Deja's actions would survive the aftermath, regardless of how carefully she handled the recovery process. She and Tamsin overhauled the studio's client-facing systems considerably in the months that followed, introducing verification protocols for any communication involving payment details, requiring in-person identification for major contract signings, small operational changes that felt, to Adrienne, both necessary and quietly devastating in what they implicitly acknowledged about how thoroughly her own sister had exploited the previous, more trusting version of how the business operated. Tamsin took the lead on much of this operational rebuilding, understanding that Adrienne needed space during those months to process the personal dimension of what had happened, while someone she trusted handled the practical restructuring the business genuinely required. Their partnership deepened considerably through this stretch, Tamsin's steady, unwavering support becoming, in Adrienne's own words, the single most stabilizing force in a year that otherwise felt like it was constantly threatening to come apart. Adrienne cut Deja out of both the business and her personal life entirely in the weeks following the confrontation, a decision she didn't arrive at quickly or without real grief, but one she ultimately understood as the only response proportionate to 2 years of sustained, deliberate deception rather than a single isolated lapse in judgment. She blocked Deja across every platform, informed their parents of the full situation once she felt steady enough to explain it clearly, and declined the handful of attempts Deja made in the following months to reopen contact. Deja's attempts at contact grew increasingly desperate over the following months, according to what Adrienne eventually heard secondhand through their parents, ranging from lengthy written apologies delivered through their mother to a brief unannounced appearance outside Adrienne's studio that Adrienne declined to engage with directly, asking a member of her staff to explain, politely but firmly, that Adrienne wasn't available. She found each attempt easier to decline than the last, understanding that her own healing required a consistency Deja's continued efforts threatened to undermine every time she allowed even a small opening. Their parents, upon learning the full scope of what had happened, struggled visibly with how to hold both daughters at once, unable to fully excuse what Deja had done while also carrying decades of protective instinct toward a child they'd watched genuinely struggle for most of her adult life. Adrienne found their difficulty understandable without allowing it to soften her own resolve, telling them plainly that she needed their support without needing them to minimize what Deja had actually done in order to give it to her. Adrienne spent considerable time in the months following the confrontation processing a specific, unusual grief she struggled to fully articulate even to Tamsin, the particular strangeness of losing not a stranger or even an ordinary sibling, but someone who shared her exact face, her exact voice. Decades of shared memory that now felt permanently complicated by 2 years she hadn't even known were happening in real time. She described it, eventually, as grieving a mirror that had turned out to be looking back at her with intentions she'd never once suspected. She began seeing a therapist roughly 3 months after the confrontation, initially reluctant to frame what she was going through as needing that level of professional support, though she found, once she started, that the specific strangeness of her situation required a kind of processing her usual coping mechanisms simply weren't built for. Her therapist helped her separate the grief for the sister she believed she had from the anger toward the sister who had actually existed all along, a distinction Adrienne found clarifying even when it didn't make the underlying loss any smaller. Foss Interiors continued growing in the year following the discovery, Adrienne and Tamsin rebuilding the client roster methodically, the studio's reputation ultimately surviving the incident largely intact once clients understood the full context and Adrienne's transparent handling of it. Adrienne found herself, nearly a year later, running a business considerably more carefully structured than before, protected in ways she'd never previously thought necessary against a specific kind of betrayal she still finds genuinely difficult to fully explain to people who ask about it. The studio took on 3 new major clients during that recovery year, each relationship built from the ground up under the new verification systems Adrienne and Tamsin had established, a fresh start that Adrienne found quietly meaningful even amid everything else she was still processing. She noticed herself approaching new client relationships with a slightly different energy than before, more careful, more intentional about establishing clear boundaries from the very first meeting, a shift she attributes directly to everything the previous year had taught her about how easily trust could be exploited by someone with intimate enough access. She doesn't describe the experience as simply a business betrayal when she talks about it now, though the financial dimension remains real and was never fully recovered. She describes it instead as the specific grief of discovering that the person who knew her most intimately in the entire world, who shared not just her childhood but her literal face, had spent 2 years deciding that version of closeness gave her permission to simply become Adrienne whenever it suited her, rather than ever doing the harder work of building something entirely her own. Adrienne says now that she doesn't know if she'll ever fully reconcile the sister she grew up with and the woman capable of what Deja actually did, and that she stopped trying to force those two people into a single understandable shape. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Psyche Tales TV for more stories about the quiet, devastating ways the people who know us best can betray that closeness, and tell us in the comments whether you think Deja's history of struggle explains any part of what she did, or whether nothing about growing up in someone's shadow ever justifies stealing their actual identity. Before you go, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.